Okay, so this is the last chapter for the media planning module, and specifically we're looking at cost considerations. So we'll be working through some cost per thousand calculations, and then building on cost efficiency, which is what cost per thousand measure, will segue into cost effectiveness and link back to some of those creative strategy discussions that we had in an earlier lecture. So cost considerations. The example I have there is cost per thousand in terms of something like a magazine ad or sometimes a TV ad. So basically for any media that you select, there's the option to try and figure out what it costs to reach 1,000 people. The other similar metric for measuring cost efficiency is your cost per thousand targeted audiences, or TCPM is the acronym that's used. So that's your targeted cost per thousand. And so even though the formula looks the same, we'll use the example of a magazine ad in the next slide to show you how the two numbers can actually end up being quite different. So here's the example of a magazine ad. Let's say it costs the company or the agency $25,000 to place an ad in a magazine. And let's say the subscription rate or the gross ratings of that magazine is 1.53 million people, right? So that means this is a magazine that has 1.53 million people subscribing to it. Now, if you recall when we talked about magazines in the media lecture, we said that that's really the only measure of the ratings or the circulation rate of a magazine, because they can only guarantee that the number of people that subscribe are those people that will read the magazine. However, we also discussed that with magazines, you've got the added benefit of people, sharing the magazine, passing them on, or a magazine, hanging out in a waiting room and being read by multiple people there. But those are all sort of hypothetical numbers. So the only number you can kind of be guaranteed of are the subscription rates. And in the previous lecture, we talked about how reach, or in this case, gross ratings, which is a measure of reach, is only ever an indication of the potential for an ad to be seen, or the potential to expose an audience member to your ad. And it's not exactly the same as a guaranteed number in terms of audiences actually engaging with the ad. For the purposes of cost per thousand calculations, often you only use the ratings that the media supplier can give you. And so if you contact or look up magazines, often they will have circulation rates, and those are really the only numbers that you can use. And some of these circulation rates are audited by an objective third party to make sure that they're actually legitimate. Otherwise, there is sort of this incentive for publishers to kind of make their circulation numbers seem higher than they are, because obviously that then means they will reach more people or have the potential to reach more people, and that then justifies the cost of advertising they can sell within their publications. And this is a similar sort of idea across all sorts of media, not just magazines. Okay, moving through this example. So it costs $25,000 to advertise in this magazine, which has a subscription of 1.53 million people. But let's say of those 1.53 million people, only 25 or 24% are in the target market that you're actually interested in communicating with. So that is 367,200 people. So if we put this through the normal calculation per thousand, so that's cost per thousand, CPM, we've got $25,000, which is the cost of placing the ad in that magazine, divided by the gross ratings or the circulation of the entire magazine times 1,000. That gives you a cost per thousand of $16.34, right? So $16.34 to reach 1,000 people, which is pretty good, right? For 16 bucks, you can reach 1,000 people. But remember, when we say reach 1,000 people, we only mean that there is the potential to expose 1,000 people to your ad, right? This doesn't really measure or tell you how quickly they're flicking past your advertisement or how much attention they're paying to it. So this kind of is starting to link to the creative strategy lecture that we had earlier. So that's cost per thousand, CPM. Now, the other metric I was talking about was the targeted cost per thousand. So you'll see already that the number is a lot higher. So that means it costs a lot more to reach 1,000 of your target audience. And so the way that makes sense is if you look at the formula, it costs the same, obviously, to place the ad in that same magazine. However, now you're dividing the cost by a much smaller number, because that number is not really, considering the 1.53 million people that subscribe to the magazine. It's only considering 24% of that 1.53 million people, which is 367,000 people, right? So if you've got the same cost and you're dividing by a smaller number because you're only concerned with reaching that smaller number, multiply that by 1,000, you're going to get this other number, which is $68, right? So it costs you $68 to reach 1,000 of your target audience. So these two numbers here are obviously quite different, and you can see how on the one hand it looks like it's quite efficient to advertise in this magazine to reach 1,000 people. But if you look a bit more closely at the TCPM, or the targeted cost per thousand, you'll see that it's not that cost effective. It actually costs you $68 to reach 1,000 target audience members. Now, I would always recommend using the TCPM, so the targeted cost per thousand, because obviously you're really only interested in reaching your target audience, right? Any other sort of audience member you reach that isn't within your target audience is theoretically a wasted exposure. And so the TCPM, even though it seems less cost efficient, is a more conservative and realistic measure of the cost of reaching 1,000 people, in this case 1,000 target audience members. So what are some limitations of the cost per thousand or targeted cost per thousand metric? It's a calculation that's only as good as the reported circulation or ratings. So I mentioned before how in the previous example we had a magazine with 1.53 million subscribers. Now that number you would hope is a very accurate number, because if that number is not accurate, then the calculation goes out the window. And I mentioned before how many publishers will actually hire an independent third-party auditor to make sure that the circulation rates that they are publicizing or reporting on their website or in negotiations with advertising agencies, they want to make sure that those numbers are legitimate. Otherwise, they lose credibility as an advertising supplier. So the CPM also only measures cost efficiency, not cost effectiveness. So we'll talk a little bit about the difference between those two things later. There's a lack of comparability across media. So if you think about the cost per thousand, the only numbers that you're worried about is how much it costs to place the ad divided by the number of people you can potentially reach, right? So it doesn't really take into account other factors. For instance, radio will have a quite efficient cost per thousand because it's cheaper than TV. But does that mean it's better? Well, it depends, right? It might cost more to reach 1,000 people with TV, but you're reaching them in a whole different way. You're reaching them not just audioly, but visually as well. And so the impact might be quite different. When we talked about TV as a traditional broadcast media in the media lecture, we said how it was a really good medium for making an impact on the audience, and also for demonstrating how a product might work, because you've got the sight and the sound. Whereas with radio, it's only ever the sound, and so that has its pros and cons as well, but it will always be cheaper than TV. And so if you compare the CPM, or the cost per thousand in radio, with TV, you're going to end up with something that seems a lot more efficient in terms of radio, but will it be more effective than TV? And that really depends on your creative tactics that you're rolling out in your advertisement. There's a risk of misusing this CPM calculation unless the vehicles within a particular medium are compared on the same basis, right? So whereas the previous bullet point talked about using TCM cautiously when comparing across media, this bullet point now is talking about using CPM even within the same medium. So for example here, let's just say we're talking about a magazine ad or a newspaper ad. You can still work out the cost per thousand for a color ad versus a black and white ad, and obviously you would assume the color ad would seem less cost efficient because it's going to cost more to place a color ad. But then again, the color ad may be more effective, and so you have to be careful there as well, even when comparing cost per thousand within the same medium and within the same vehicles sometimes. So there's basically a trade-off that has to be made because media planners are always operating within a fixed budget. So they have to kind of decide not only on which media are the most cost effective, but also which may be the most cost efficient. And they're trading up between those two things to try to get the best result possible given the objectives that have been set in place. So this is also a balance between reach and frequency sometimes. So in one of the previous lectures, we talked about reach and frequency being two considerations when you're specifying your media planning objectives. And so cost per thousand will be able to help with that, particularly in terms of how much it costs to reach 1,000 people. And if it seems like it's very efficient, then you can double down on that particular media and try and ramp the frequency up. On the other hand, if your cost per thousand comes back very inefficient, then you might want to think twice because you need to save some of that budget perhaps and use it in a different medium, or perhaps to try and increase the frequency in order to get your story across a little bit more clearly. So message effectiveness is then something that we have to consider when we look at cost efficiency versus cost effectiveness. So the previous few slides mainly focused on this, the importance of reach and frequency, and those are typically measured by a cost per thousand, right? It's a very sort of, I guess, a black or white number in terms of this is how much it costs to reach 1,000 people. And if it costs this much and we, spend twice the amount on the same media and run it for twice as long, then the frequency is likely to become twice as high. And so even though that's very black and white, it's not exactly the only way to look at how you might spend your budget. So although those concepts of reach and frequency are very important, the effectiveness of each individual ad should also be taken into account. And this is when we start to link back to the lecture on creative strategy. Some ads are simply more effective at conveying a message, typically those that are very creative. So effective ads require less frequency. So in that case, your cost per thousand can be quite high, but it doesn't matter because what you're saying is that with a very effective ad, you only need to reach those 1,000 people, once, and the message can sink in. And so then you don't have to worry about repeating your message over and over again as much. And you can spend your money on the media that have the best cost per thousand, because you just need to reach as many people as possible with your one really fantastic ad, and then the message should sink in. However, if you have a very ineffective ad because it's not particularly creative or it's kind of lost in the clutter, then your approach to your cost per thousand metric will be slightly different, because what you're saying then is with an ineffective ad you may need to repeat your message multiple times, and so you need to be mindful of how much it's costing you to reach every 1,000 people, because the implicit argument is that you may need to reach those same people over and over again, which means you need to dial back your budget and save it for those multiple exposures. Not all exposures are equal, and here is just a simple diagram showing the 3 different ways you can try to make your exposure or your message more effective. So there's the enhancing the opportunity, you can enhance the motivation, and you can also enhance the ability of your target audience to process your ad. So enhancing motivation. In order to do that, you need to attend to the message you're trying to convey. Using novel stimuli, intense cues, even something as simple as motion will enhance the motivation of people to process your ad. Remember the interactive billboard we talked about in the media lecture? Something as simple as that, something that catches your eye because of motion, will automatically get people to want to attend to it. Think about the way the target audience processes brand information as well. You can use something called a resonance strategy, which we looked at in the creative strategy lecture. So that's when you make your values of your brand align with the lifestyle of your target audience. Now, when something is relevant to someone, they're obviously enhanced or motivated to want to pay attention to it, right? You can increase curiosity by asking rhetorical questions. This is a common advertising technique where instead of stating something, they ask you something. So humans are hardwired to respond to questions with more attention. Once again, doing so will encourage or enhance the motivation of the target audience to process your ad. You're trying to satisfy their needs in some way, make them feel good. That's why emotional appeals are so popular in advertising, because humans, once again, are hardwired or motivated to pay attention to emotions. And so that's why a lot of advertising techniques in terms of creative strategy use an emotional appeal, because they know that people want to process ads that make them feel something. Also, using things like family scenes, romance, humor, these are all very common strategies that you see advertisers use when they creatively roll out an advertisement in order to enhance the target audience to be motivated to pay attention to the ad. Enhancing opportunity is another thing to consider in terms of cost effectiveness or message effectiveness. So you can encode information in a way by repeating the brand information, repeating key scenes, repeat basically, but not just in terms of frequency, remember, because then that is all about cost efficiency. When we're talking about cost effectiveness, we want to make sure that every single message that you send, or every single time a person sees an ad, they have these opportunities to really encode and understand what your brand is about. So thematically, you want to repeat stuff. So this reduces processing time. So you want to make sure that within an IMC or integrated marketing communications campaign, every time they see your ad, it's the same story being told. It's the same message, right? And so then instead of having to repeat in terms of frequency and paying money to place the ad over and over again, they should be able to get that repetition of information within the same ad each time. So using pictures and imagery is another way of reducing processing time and enhancing the opportunity that a target audience can process your message more effectively. There's the old saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that's certainly true in advertising, because you see a lot of ads using, striking images, and its ability to sort of, I guess, break through, a lot of text and capture information by having a really stunning visual will then obviously increase the opportunity for a customer group to understand what your brand is about, or even simply the opportunity to pay attention to your ad. Enhancing ability. So by accessing existing knowledge structures, you're slotting your message or your advertisement into the right mental place. Now, failing that, let's say you can't find a way of tapping into an existing knowledge structure, then you want to build your own knowledge structure. And I'll have an example coming up soon about how you do that for a new brand or a rebrand. But basically what you're doing there is you're constructing your own mental scaffolding so that it makes it easier for the consumers to process information and tag any new thing you're saying about your brand into an existing mental structure that they have. So if you see a new product, for example, to do with dental hygiene, often they will be trying to position that product into an existing ritual, which is, a knowledge structure that exists in terms of your daily dental care routine, right? And so, you brush your teeth, you do the mouthwash, you might floss, and so there's already a structure in place. And if you wanted to introduce a new product, let's just say, for example, a toothbrush cleaning product, then it's very easy to slot that in, and that enhances the ability of the target audience to process your message more effectively, because you're linking into something they understand already. They understand they, floss, they use mouthwash, they brush their teeth, and now you're telling them they need to, sterilize their toothbrush afterwards. So that fits into that ritual, and that makes it very easy for people to understand what you're talking about. Now, provided you're a product that doesn't have an existing knowledge structure, then you can make your own structures. And then once that's established, it becomes very easy to tag on new product information you may have in the future. You can create your definite brand benefits because benefits are very easy to remember, right? And so all that means is that you have to be very clear about what your brand does well. So remember this brand, this is a brand that I've done some consulting on. As you know, it's an organic fish fertilizer based on using the waste product of the fishing industry, it's Aquaticus. And so here's a really good example of how we had to create a new knowledge structure for consumers, because did not exist beforehand, and this brand was essentially a completely rebranded product with new packaging and everything. So we had to almost start from scratch. So we recreated this circular pattern here, and you see that repeats in each iteration of the brand. So we're repeating this, but not necessarily in a frequency sort of way, but we're repeating this information thematically. So whenever someone sees this circular pattern, they know it's to do with the same brand, right? And also with the circular structure, you'll notice that there are four sort of main product categories. There's the conditioning product, the boosting product, the protecting product, and the controlling product, right? And so this, once again, creates this knowledge structure so that in the future, if new products are created, it'll be easier to tap into this existing structure of the four things that you need to worry about when you do your home vegetable gardening, for example. And so you see the repetition here, you see the knowledge structure. So this really enhances the ability of the target audience to process any advertising we may have regarding this brand. Right, so finishing off this module on media planning, we've got some multi-choice questions. So I'll start with this one. Anita's local hair salon. During an established time frame, her target audience was exposed to 3 of her advertisements. So what does the 3 represent? The correct answer is frequency, right? Because the target audience in general was exposed 3 times, and frequency is the average number of times your target audience is exposed to your ad. Second question. The percentage of a target audience that is exposed at least once to an advertiser's message during an established time frame represents what? Is it reach, spread, scope, frequency, or your gross rating points? So the correct answer there is reach, because remember, reach is the percentage or proportion of a target audience that is exposed at least once. The third question. In a something advertising schedule, equal or approximate equal amounts of advertising dollars are invested throughout the campaign. So you'll recall that there were 3 different types of advertising schedules: continuous, pulsing, and flighting. And so the correct answer there is continuous, because continuous was the one where you have approximately the same amount of budget allocated throughout the entire campaign. And it was really good for products that are used sort of consistently throughout time, such as toilet paper is always a good example. This question here assumed that an advertising campaign reached 60% of the target market. The target market was reached 6 times on average. So remember that the frequency, in this case 6, multiplied by the reach, which is 60%, usually gives you advertising weight, and gross rating points are a way of describing advertising weight. So in this particular case, 6 times 60 gives you 360. So that's 360 gross rating points. So to summarize, media strategy consists of 4 steps. The first is selecting that right audience. Then you need to specify your media objectives, and typically these are done by looking at things like reach, frequency, and weight, but also the continuity in terms of scheduling, and whether you want to spread out your advertising budget or concentrate it at specific times of the year, depending on the window of opportunity of the target market. The third thing is to select the media that best suit the objectives you have, and so we mainly looked at that in the previous module on media. And finally, cost considerations, which is what we looked at today. And within cost considerations, we have CPM, which is your cost per thousand, and your TCPM, which is your targeted cost per thousand. And that's a more preferable number because it's a more conservative estimate of how much it costs to reach 1,000 of your targeted audience members. But we also said that advertisers have to always make a trade-off and decide between reach and frequency, right? Because not many companies, if any, have the budget to maximize reach and maximize frequency. And so you really want to trade off between the two and reach the right number of people, the right number of times in order to communicate the value that your brand can provide to them. CPM is a useful tool, but it's not perfect, so it is an imperfect metric, and we looked at some of the reasons why. And not all exposures are equal. And so this ties us right back to the creative strategy lecture when we looked at, creativity as something that can make every single exposure more impactful and more effective. And so that directly relates to how you would then justify your budget. All right, thanks guys.